This is a recording of a Pages of Hackney event that took place on Tuesday the 28th of February 2023, when we welcomed Alva Gotby and Helen Hester to Pages to discuss Alva's new book, They Call It Love, on the politics of emotional life, which was published in January by Verso. Alva Gotby is a writer and organiser living in London. She holds a PhD in Media Studies from the University of West London and an MA in Philosophy and Contemporary Critical Theory from the Centre for Research in Modern European Philosophy, Kingston University. She has written on feminist theory, social reproduction, housing, emotions and family, and is active in struggles to abolish prisons and landlords. Helen Hester is Professor of Gender, Technology and Work at the University of West London. Her research interests include technology, social reproduction and the future of work, and she's a member of the international feminist working group Laboria Cubinix. Her books include Beyond Explicit, Pornography and the Displacement of Sex, Xenofeminism, and her forthcoming book, After Work, A History of the Home and the Fight for Free Time, is written with Nick Cernacek and due out with Verso in July 2023.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. It's literally always a pleasure to be at Pages, but it is a particular pleasure to be here to celebrate this book because I have seen it develop over the course of several years. So I was Alva's PhD supervisor, and I saw the thesis that this kind of emerged out of. So I am very much not an unbiased person in this equation. But I do think I'm pretty well placed to talk about kind of the strengths of the work and why it's interesting and kind of get into some of the issues and questions that it raises. So I'll read my blurb on the back. Again, further proof that I'm not unbiased here. So I said, They Call It Love brings together existing bodies of work on unwaged social reproduction and remunerated emotional labour to great effect, shining a light upon a too often overlooked and heavily gendered form of work. It is sharp, thoughtful and well written and represents a substantial scholarly achievement. And I stand by that, it definitely does. So before we get started, Alva has just asked that I explain a little bit about what social reproduction is for those of you who aren't used to kind of seeing that term bandied around. So it's about basically the work of reproducing people on a daily or generational level and class societies at the same time. So we associate it a lot with things like care work and the maintenance of people, but also the maintenance of spaces, the maintenance of communities, and then all of the work that goes into creating a workforce that can be functional. So it's not just about reproducing individuals, it is also about what's required to make capitalist society tick. So, as we're sort of saying there, we're going to start with a reading from Alva, we're going to have a little bit of discussion, then we're going to go in with a second reading, a little bit more discussion, and then we're going to open it up to a Q&A. Obviously, it's all really kind of informal and chilled out, so please, if you've got any questions about anything that needs clarifying or any sort of big conceptual issues, all questions and comments are welcome here. So just bear that in mind as you're listening and thinking. And I'll pass over to Dr. Gotby.
Thanks, Helen, for introducing. And it's really great to be here. Thanks for coming. I'm going to start by reading a few pages from the introduction of this book, just because I wanted to sort of open it up by setting out some of the key concerns, topics that we'll be discussing in a bit. So this section is basically trying to introduce some of the concerns that this book sort of deals with, and particularly the concept of emotional reproduction, which we'll talk a bit about later, and trying to explain how that's related to questions around work, gender, and sort of saying a little bit about how some of the conceptual history or background of that concept as well, what kind of sources are drawn. So it's just to sort of get us started. The capitalist economy is dependent on people doing the work of caring for each other, either for free or for the low wages associated with reproductive service work. This work is often understood as unskilled, naturally feminine, and therefore a woman's duty, which she should should be carried out with little or no monetary reward. As Sarah Jaffe writes, a willingness to accede that women's work is love and that love is its own reward, not to be sullied with money, creates profit for capital. End of quote. Love's work is often relegated to the so-called private sphere of the home, and thus it is disavowed in modern political discourses. While incredibly common and mundane as a type of work, this activity has often been made invisible in economic and political analysis, including Marxist writing and organizing. The task of the Marxist feminist tradition is to make this work visible in order to struggle against its current organization. Decades of feminist writing and agitation have begun to undo some of the privatization of reproduction, the process through which reproductive labor becomes an individual responsibility relegated to the private sphere. A shift in the capitalist economy meant that much of reproduction now takes place outside the home. But reproduction is still understood as primarily the responsibility of the family, a social unit seen as the opposite of the capitalist sphere of work, a haven in a heartless world. Such privatization of the burden and cost of reproductive work, as well as the construction of a low-wage service economy, served to maintain women's subordinate position in a supposedly post-feminist era in which most legal constraints on women's independent existence have been removed. The privatization of care makes women responsible for the well-being of others and undermines their financial and material independence, while simultaneously constructing them as the people most suitable for this work and perpetuating the existence of a gender division of labor. Emotional reproduction includes the form of work that go into maintaining people's emotional well-being and their ability and willingness to continue to engage in capitalist productive labor, often despite the considerable emotional strain produced by this work. Thinking about emotion across waged and unwaged sectors, I want to emphasize the work that goes into sustaining some degree of emotional well-being in people, such as comforting a loved one or making small talk with a lonely relative. Emotional reproduction is a broad term which denotes the work of creating not only certain feelings, but the desires, needs, subjectivities, and forms of sociality that are both cause and effects of such labor. It is the formation of specific needs and the ways in which those needs are satisfied. Emotional reproduction creates a feeling of investment in the world as it is. We have emotional attachment to a particular notion of a good life, a normative way of life which seems to promise comfort and happiness. Our lives under capitalism are in many ways disappointing and continually create negative feelings such as stress, resentment, depression, and loneliness. But we all have an attachment to particular ideas of what a good life should look like, one that often includes the very sources of harm. We often continue to aspire to these ideals of the good life, even when they continually let us down. When thinking about emotional reproduction, I draw on the concept of emotional labor, a term coined by sociologist Ali Russell Hochschild in her 1983 book, The Managed Heart: Commercialization of Human Feeling. Hochschild traces a shift in capitalist economies in which the growing service economy relies on the increased commodification of our emotional capacities. Commodification is the process through which an object or service becomes something that can be bought and sold on the market. Hochschild's theory is based on a study of flight attendants, a traditionally feminized profession that involves not only serving food and drinks, but also creating a sense of safety and emotional comfort in airline passengers. Feminized forms of emotional labor are oriented towards, quote, affirming, enhancing, and celebrating the well-being and status of others, end of quote. From the example of flight attendants, Hochschild draws out a theory of the importance of emotion across a number of service jobs which are increasingly central to capitalist economies in Europe and North America. So emotional labour has been commodified. It's been turned into a service that can be bought and sold. Following Hochschild, a number of researchers have studied the commodification of emotional labour in contemporary capitalism. But rather than seeing as emotional labour as a phenomenon emerging with a growing service economy, I trace a longer history of emotional reproduction as part of both waged and unwaged forms of reproductive labour. The commodification of emotional labour has made such labour more visible, but it did not create it. By using the concept of emotional reproduction, I want to point to a broader process than one usually described in sociological studies of emotional labour, and include activities that would normally not be considered work. These activities may nonetheless contribute to the emotional well-being of people and should be politicized within the framework of reproduction. Like social reproduction more broadly, emotional reproduction operates across spheres of unwaged and waged work. The point of this book is not to deny the need for emotional reproduction or call for its complete rejection. It's not a call to abandon forms of labour associated with femininity or to grant women access to more masculine types of subjectivity. Fully rejecting the feminized work of care would be both impossible and undesirable. Rather, refusal of emotional reproduction refers to a mode of resistance that goes beyond a binary construction of gendered subjectivity, seeking to repurpose emotions, needs, and desires in order to find new ways of being together. This form of refusal of emotional reproduction might draw on potentials existing in the present, including aspects of traditionally feminine subjectivity, but in ways that do not support the reproduction of the present. This relies on the denaturalization of femininity, regarding it as an acquired capacity rather than something inherent in particular subjects. In this way, we can begin to consider emotion not merely as a merely spontaneous or natural state, but as a type of skillful work. The concept of emotional labour helps us rethink both emotion, often regarded as passive, and labour, which tends to be constructed as conscious activity. Emotion is not merely a passive psychological state, but neither must something be fully conscious or active for it to be usefully considered as labour. To labour is to do something, but that something might not always be recognisable as activity. And what we may legitimately call labour might always involve a product of some kind. This product will not always be recognizable as a thing separate from its producer. Emotional labour is difficult to think about, since the better it's done, the more it appears as non-work, both for the labourer themselves and for the recipient of emotional care. All labour may involve effort on the side of the labourer, yet such exertion may appear as a merely natural expression of the labouring subject. In emotional labour processes, in particular, the result of the work is often invisible as a product and comes to appear as an aspect of the personality of the worker. As Sophie Lewis argues, in these forms of labour, quotes, a feminized person's body is typically becoming further feminized. It's working very, very hard at having the appearance of not working at all, end of quote. Our labour practices, therefore, become aspects of what we experience as our authentic selves. In its seeming passivity, emotional labour is similar to other feminized forms of work. It's ironic that the labour associated with femininity is often seen as passive, and that femininity is associated with receptivity, as women do much of the work of reproducing other people. Some of the discomfort with the term emotional labour, as well as its popularity inside and outside academic discourse, probably stems from this seeming conceptual mismatch between emotion and labour. The concept's impropriety makes it both expansive and confusing, placing all sorts of phenomena under its banner. But this expansiveness is part of the nature of emotional labour, and it's important to theorize it despite its elusiveness. otherwise we leave emotion unexamined, falling back on common sense notions of emotion as natural, intimate, non-social, and spontaneous.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. So I'm sure there are questions sort of stirring in people's minds already. Because I know the work, I've been thinking about what I want to get into with you. So the book is about the politics of emotional life. That's the subheading. And so it considers, and you sort of got into this a little bit in your little introductory spiel there, that it sort of considers some of the ways in which love, so that's sort of our romantic or our domestic or our intimate or our familial lives, are far from being a sort of straightforward haven from a heartless world, or some kind of space away from or outside of capitalism, are actually, in fact, very much a space of politics, a field in which politics is enacted, and they are very much a political matter. Mm. So maybe sort of an initial question to kind of start our discussion. They call it love. What kind of love are we talking about here? What kinds of love do you address in the book? And what forms of love do you take to be a political problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that part of the project of this book is to think about love not as a sort of universal, the thing that we all love, and that has this like almost like religious like status of like a sort of secular religious status of like having a status of like the kind of the promise of redemption. If we can just like find true love in our lives, all of our problems will like be sort of sorted and it will be smooth sailing. And I wanted to challenge that, basically that status that this particular notion of love has in our society, and say actually this is not a sort of universal concept. This is like a very specific historical phenomenon that we can actually trace back as like a fairly like recent thing that did emerge kind of around the same time as like capitalist society was becoming more established and as bourgeois culture sort of came to dominate society. And with that you had a particular form of romantic love. You also had a particular form of sort of families and a new ideal of a family that was like much smaller than previous ideas of what a household would look like. And you have this idea that a family is like a mother, father, and a few children, and that the home is where they live and where our emotional lives sort of take place, and that's a private sphere that's separate from capitalist society. So you have this idea of capitalist society as sort of free of feeling in a way, in a sphere of competition, and in some discourses a sphere of like rationality. And then you have this very feminized private sphere, which is a sphere of love. And that's sort of where our needs, and especially our emotional needs, are supposed to be met. So you have these like very intense, very privatized sort of emotional connections to a very small group of people, and those relationships are sort of supposed to meet all our needs. They sort of become the goal of life, especially for women, right? To have that is to have sort of made it as a woman, and in a way that's like that's a sort of deeply Victorian ideal, but it's still something that we can recognize today, right? Even as people are like less likely to sort of get married quite young and then stay married for the rest of their lives, or get less likely to have this like very strict gender division of labor. It still has this like cultural status as like the thing to aspire to, and so I wanted to think about love as that's something that's like very specific, and also, as you were saying, it's like a very political thing that like actually if we start unpicking it, we can see how that's like very gendered, obviously, but also like very linked with certain class ideals, and ideas about like race and nation, so saying that this idea of like romance and like love within the family is actually this very, very specific thing that's very tied up with like various ideologies and forms of dominance, but also thinking about how it's something like that is very broad and it's quite hard to escape from. So even those who are like not really identifying with that, like those of us who have like a feminist critique or feel like actually I don't want to be a housewife. That's like not my goal in life. I think it's quite hard to sort of step outside of that. And I was thinking about again quoting Sophie Lewis in their new book. They have this thing about how it's so hard to think outside the family because you can't really reject the thing that has produced you. And I think that's the sort of challenge here is that we can say, oh, that's like a very specific type of love, and we're gonna like, we don't want that, so we're just like gonna say no to it. But it's actually very hard, and the way that it's been both like imposed on people who haven't been from that like very specific like sort of like a sort of white bourgeois like heterosexual family, but that model has still been imposed on people, and to some extent it has been like actively desired as well, so I think it's hard to say well that type of love is bad, or like that type of family is what we should reject, but like other forms of love are like fine, because it's like it's quite hard to like disentangle that from like other types or ideals of love that we do have in the present. So I think there are definitely like potentials for like more sort of radical ways of being together that we can already see in the present. It's also like quite difficult. So I have this sort of critique of the slogan "Love is love," which is my personal bugbear, which is used by some of the more mainstream like LGBT movement to articulate that like gay and lesbian love is like the same as heterosexual love, so therefore it's good and we all feel love in the same way. And I think that's a bit of a
what do you think about moves to kind of frame sort of different kinds of relationality in terms of love? So if you're thinking about comradeship as a form of love, do you think that there is any sort of political potential in that move to reconceptualize what love is, or is it not about the exploding of love through its broadening beyond the heterosexual family, but actually about finding new ways of articulating what it means to have meaningful relationships with people?
Yeah, I mean, I think people often like to say that something is a politics of love, and I'm like, I don't really know what that means. Maybe I'm just like being too narrow in my sort of conceptualization, but I also think there's like, we want to call things that we think are good love, and it's like, maybe that's helpful, but I don't know. I don't know what that's doing. And I think when I think about like a politics of solidarity and a politics of like comradeship, like that's a form of like extending the it's not about extending necessarily like the feeling of love. Like I don't know a lot of those people that I would be in like solidarity with. Like I have like no emotional connection to them, but I can still like recognize them as like people who I somehow like share a struggle with. So for me, that's like a more useful way of framing it. I don't really know what people are trying to do when they say something. It's like a politics of love. But
because it sort of mobilizes this idea that a kind of like intense affective attachment is required in order to do politics. When I think that actually, you know, what then happens to the unlovable, like, is fall through the cracks. I can't extend my intense emotional attachment to you, therefore you're not a worthy object of my politics. Like, I think, so I completely take that point. I had sort of the similar wrestling with the idea. Sort of my version of the love is love discussion. It attaches around the sort of the figure of the child and the way the child gets mobilized in sort of a lot of political discourses about the future. Most obviously kind of climate change discourse, that the child is this sort of, we have to do it for our children, you know, we have to sort of remake the world for them. And the way that then kind of lapses into a sort of reproductive futurism, where actually the needs of actually existing adults are really pushed aside in terms of this idea of, but then you have the same set of discussions, which is like whether it's useful, like whether it's politically expedient to piggyback on the basis of rhetorical flourishes that we know gain mainstream traction very easily, or whether it's better to understand that actually the baggage that comes with those rhetorical flourishes makes them not actually worth taking up. And, you know, it's really hard to develop like a hard and fast rule about like when we can do things with love and when we can't.
Yeah, sure. And so I think I'm a little bit like, I don't necessarily want to be like, oh, all of the uses of that word. I'm just we're just gonna ban that word from any political discourse. But yeah, I often find it a bit like a sort of, I guess I'm like interested in why people think that's a useful framing, rather than saying like, I don't know, that like, what if they're talking about like a sort of pro-migration politics as like a politics of love, like why can't we just say that like migrants are people that we stand in solidarity with them, and it doesn't have to be built on a sort of that like a very strong like emotional attachment to these people that we probably never met. Like,
I mean, I think solidarity is an interesting word in the sense that it involves a more obvious interplay of like distance and proximity, right? You know, whereas love seems to assume a kind of at least imaginative proximity with somebody. I think solidarity, there has to be an element of identity, because you can only be in solidarity with struggles that are sort of within your own political project, that makes sense to struggle alongside somebody within the terms of your own political project. But it also, there has to be difference, because it would make no sense to talk about being in solidarity with yourself. Solidarity with Helen Hester, it doesn't work. So there's this sort of this more obvious interplay of like shared interests, but also this acceptance of a degree of distance that it doesn't make sense to suppress or pretend isn't there. You know, that's actually, you build it into the political project instead of saying like, love is love and everything is the same, and everything in the world is absolutely identical.
And I guess coming from a like perspective of trying to move away from this like very like the idea that care should be this like very private thing that is reserved for like a small group of people around us. Like, I just think it's important to like try to expand what we're doing a bit like beyond those, that we can actually have some kind of meaningful emotional investment in.
Yeah, I really do agree with that, because this idea that care is, because it's such an easy word to charge with positive affect care, isn't it? And this idea of it being a form of closeness and extending sort of tenderness, and then the way that does mean that people who are difficult to care for, or are where being in proximity with everybody isn't necessarily going to be pleasant, but those people still deserve care. So,
Yeah.
Maybe to change tack a little bit. So the book is about the work of emotional support and care, and again, that's something that came through really clearly in your introduction, that this is a book about work to some extent, and that love needs to be considered within the framework of work. But I wonder if you could say a little bit about why it is that you approach the problem of love through the problem of work. What does it do to bring those two sets of ideas together? What does it enable you to do? And what's the political work that's being performed by bringing those ideas into conversation?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most like everyday associations we have with work is that it's something that requires like some effort, and I think that's actually quite useful as a starting point. And thinking about it as thinking about doing emotional support for other people as something that requires effort is actually in itself quite useful, because I think it's often like sort of, as I was in the part that I was just reading, I think it's often something that's seen as sort of naturally coming from certain personalities, and particularly like people who are experienced as like feminine, caring, and so on, often have seen as this like natural like gift for just like emotionally supporting other people. So thinking about it as something that we do, and that actually involves a bit of like it involves our own like energy when we do it, and it's also like doing something in the world. It's not just this like nice feeling. It's something that has like an impact on how the world is functioning, and I try to think about it in terms of like how the capitalist economy functions, like what's the role of love within the capitalist economy, so thinking about it as like doing something within that as a way of like situating love or emotional support within like a broader framework of how society functions, is, I think, is really important. And I think it can sort of help us start like unpack some of those assumptions about who is doing this and why. This idea that that work is also like shaping us, shaping our experiences of the world, shaping our subjectivity, how we experience other people, how we relate to other people, has been like really important for developing this project. Because I think when we start thinking about work as something that's also like doing something to ourselves, we can like have a much more like social, political understanding of subjectivity, and we can start thinking about this work as something that we are sort of, some people are trained to do. So it's not just that like some people are like naturally very good with like dealing with other people's emotions. Like some people have been like, since they were very young, have been like trained to be attentive to the emotional needs of others. So that's like a form of skill, and that's a form of skilled work. And that framework, I think, is helpful because it, rather than understanding love as this like very private thing, that's it's just like natural. It's universal. We can sort of begin to understand it as a political issue, which is obviously the whole project of this book. And this question of like who is doing it and why, who is providing emotional support for whom, like who's as you were saying, like outside of like any form of like care. I think those are like really important questions, and like by starting from the point of thinking about this as work, like really helps us get to that as like thinking about emotion as a political problem, and also start thinking about like, well, if it's been organized this way, could it be differently? Could we like change who's doing this? Can we like even start thinking about like on the needs that we have, are they shaped by certain forms of work? Could they be sort of made differently? So for me, it's been really like a way of opening up those questions and like actually starting to get to a point where we can say, actually, the way that this work has been organized is not what we want. It's not really working as well as we would want. And I think that has just been like really important to sort of get to a point where we can say that we don't want this, and we don't want the way that we have also been like made through this process of labor, and to start to like think about like how that can be refused, how it can be done differently, is like a really
classic wages for housework thing, isn't it? That like, you know, you have to be able to name something as work as the first step to be able to sort of refuse it. You know, there's that like classic tradition that actually, when you label something as work, you open up a whole new set of dynamics around it and new possibilities attached to it, and access a whole toolkit of refusal that's attached to work, rather than sort of naturalized gender habits or whatever. Sort of two things that I was thinking about. First of all, do you know Nancy Hartsock and sort of Kathy Weeks's kind of work around the ontology of labour? Yeah, I thought it was really, really interesting, this idea that sort of what we do makes us. And I'm really interested in where that sort of, that idea of like doing and being coming together connects to sort of discourses around performativity and this idea that, you know, what you do constitutes what you are. And I wonder if you have any sort of opinions on whether work and labour represent particularly sort of privileged or significant ideas in terms of the performativity of gender. Do you think there's a particular weight attached to work and labour in terms of how we do gender or make gender or embody gender? And if so, why is it work and labour in particular that becomes sticky around these things?
Yeah, I'm just now like trying to think back to Kathy Weeks's discussion about this, because I think it's like really good and important, and the way that she like sort of critically reframes like Judith Butler's work within like a Marxist feminist framework has been like really important for this project as well. And I think I'm gonna try to like paraphrase a little bit what Kathy Weeks says about it, which is that I think the concept of work or labor is doing something because it can sort of get away from the like slightly like voluntaristic framing that some of like performance that the idea that I think is maybe a bit of a misreading of Butler, but like that people have said about Butler's work is that, well, if it's all performance, like we could just like do something different, and it's like really is kind of like very random. And I think the point that Weeks makes about that is like the way that work is something that's both like a creative act, that we are sort of continually involved in the remaking of the world, but it also has this like sort of imposition of a certain set of things. We're not doing it just because it's fun, or like we're doing it to meet our own needs, like the needs of those around us. So this idea that work is something that we are sort of made to do, is quite sort of key for how I understand that concept. I think that's useful to think about, because it can also like think about activities that for some people are work but not for others, and so it's kind of interesting because it opens up a sort of a possibility of something currently being work because it's attached to like certain forms of like certain needs that we have. For example, like there's a sense of that we are like we sort of have to do those things, but that's actually not, it doesn't have to be that way. Like something could be something that we are doing to express ourselves. If we were living in a society where we were free, there weren't these like you have to do this, otherwise you will have no access to the things that you need to live. So that's maybe a bit of an like abstract answer, but I think that there's something that's really important about this like coercive aspects of work, that's like really interesting for me to think about in relation to gender.
No, I think you're completely right that that's kind of framing is useful because it gives gender a certain kind of obstinacy. It acknowledges the obstinacy of gender whilst not lapsing into this idea that it is unchangeable. So, like work, it is something which has its own set of dynamics that you can't just overhaul on an individual basis, but that has to be sort of collectively restructured and reworked. But it's not impossible to do that, but it is a sort of durational project rather than a voluntaristic one. Yeah, that's really interesting. I've got this thing, my little slogan, that gender is a workplace technology. And so I've been sort of trying to think through what some of the implications of that are, and I think all of that discussion is very relevant to that idea. And then I guess my other comment would be, so you sort of point to the fact that all work involves effortful activity, on the one hand, but of course all effortful activity is not work.
Yeah.
So that kind of then gets into the difficulty with love, because I think people like to think that love is one of the forms of like meaningful, significant, worthwhile, damned seriousness, to kind of, borrow Marx's phrase. But that it's separate from work, that it's effortful activity without being work.
Yeah.
Is that kind of like a thorny issue to sort of negotiate in terms of your work?
Yeah, I mean, sure. And to some extent, like the book is saying, well, I don't think that's a very useful way of thinking about it, because it's not outside how society more widely function, and it's not this like separate thing that we can sort of retreat from our real work into just like love and the sphere of the family. So thinking about those things sort of in relation has been like really important for this project, and like thinking about emotional labor is not something that becomes bad when it's commodified and we have to do it for people we don't know, but like that there's something as society is currently structured, there is no like really an outside that we can just like go back to and relax and say, now my day's work is done, and I'm just gonna sort of be with my loved ones, and that's the expression of my sort of human essence.
And that whole thing is such a sort of a masculinized fantasy that's attached to industrial capitalism.
Right?
Yeah, the whole idea is that you can move towards the 3/8. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. That depends on this idea that you can return to a space, whereas for some people that space is already a workplace. And you're there all the time. And yes, of course, I completely take your point about it. You can't really frame something as being autonomously chosen activity when it's also so normatively saturated as being something you should want, as being something that should be a sort of orienting horizon for what constitutes a meaningful life in the 21st century. You can't sort of, it's not something you just dip into. It is normatively saturated. I'm very aware that, because I'm enjoying this conversation so much, time is running away from me. So I'm going to ask you one more question, because I think this is one that is very of great interest to me, and hopefully of great interest to other people, before we move on to your second reading. And this is about sort of the fact that the concept of emotional labour has gained so much traction in recent years. I'm sure people have seen it kind of being bandied around journalistic discourse, social media discourse, as being used to sort of reframe all kinds of caregiving and support as being a form of labour. So if you're listening to your partner complain, that's sort of emotional labour that you deserve remuneration for. If you're helping a friend through depression, that's a form of emotional labour that deserves to be kind of recognised. And so the more that this idea has been popularised, the more it also seems to have been extended. And then you get this sort of concomitant pushback against the idea from some quarters, where it's like, no, emotional labour is what Hochschild said it is, which is the kind of thing that you do for a wage. It's part of the commodification of emotional life. I wondered, how has that, or do you think, how will that affect the way that your work is received? How does that affect the whole idea in which emotional reproduction kind of gets couched or understood by people?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not I wouldn't describe myself as very online, so I think sometimes I miss this.
Far too sensible to be very online.
Sometimes I miss that I don't really follow Twitter discourse about this too much. But from what I've seen of it, is you get this very individualized framework basically, and so I don't think the problem with that is so much what people are necessarily the activities that people sort of put under that banner of emotional labor. I'm sure of it, sometimes it is but I think the way that discourse has become very detached from any sense of this being part of a broader system of social reproduction, that's the thing where it becomes quite strange, because it has this framing that's very oh, well, if something is emotional labor, it's necessarily bad, and I should walk away from doing it. I don't want anything to do with that emotional labor. I'm just going to go and be an individual over here by myself. And that's obviously quite different from what I'm trying to do in the book, which is saying a lot of the unwaged social interactions we have are about trying to change the emotional status of another person, and that can be very draining, very tiring. It's also related to how society more broadly is structured. So if we want to change that, we probably have to do something other than just being no, I don't care for this interaction. I'm just gonna go sort of hang out by myself. So to be very Marxist about it is it's not sufficiently materialist understanding of emotional labor. So I think that's kind of the problem. But I think it's also interesting because it points to this this desire for using that vocabulary, and I think it is something that's real, that even if the way that people frame it is often like very, it's quite liberal a lot of the time. And I think it's sort of interesting to me that this is happening at a time when we're also like experiencing this like very reactionary, like very like discourse on gender, and we see a sort of return to like very like sort of traditional, but like obviously like made up traditional ideas about like what a good life looks like for a woman, which is like you get to express your natural femininity through like taking care of your family,
Baking.
yeah. And those things sort of happening at the same time. It's just we're in quite a confused moment in terms of like how we relate to.
I'm sure that the very online amongst us will have seen that trad wife on Twitter. Yeah, I see the nods. There's a lot of trad wife discourse at the moment.
Yeah.
Yes, you're wise to stay away from it. Yeah. I think that kind of gets to a heart of a lot of the things that are sort of really, really interesting about this project. Because for me, in some ways, this whole concept of emotional reproduction is like charting a course between these things, right? So that as a concept, it sort of allows you to short circuit some of these sort of discursive dead ends by going like, okay, well, it's not emotional labour in the sense that Hochschild meant it exactly. It's much more akin to her concept of emotional work, but it still deserves to be talked about as a form of sort of as a form of effortful activity and as one that is learned rather than sort of spontaneously occurring, and as something that's sort of that is sort of couched in a lot of deep imbalances and gender imbalances in terms of who's expected to do that work. So it gives it that weight and that significance without then saying, oh well, this is exactly what air hostesses do. This is exactly what the flight attendant does. It's this. So you've kind of provided a handy tool for the next time there's a flare up of emotional labour discourse on Twitter. I will be referring to your book.
Hopefully.
No greater praise than being a tool in a framework. Okay, so should we move on to your second reading?
Yeah.
And then I will. I think I've got a couple more questions, and then we'll throw it to everybody who's here.
Yeah. Just to sort of move us towards like starting to think about more of a like political. Yeah, sort of how to think about how do we start to resist this? Like, are there ways out of this? I thought I'd read a bit from the beginning of chapter 4, which is called Feminist Emotions, and it's basically using some of the writings of the Wages for Housework movement that Helen mentioned, which is like probably the most important like intellectual source of this book. And they were writing a lot about how sort of capitalist reproduction is based on gendered labor, and they also had this idea that like through feminist struggle we can like sort of start to resist that. So I'm gonna just read a little bit about how they thought we could like how I read them, thinking about like emotions like through a feminist lens. In order for resistance and confrontation to become possible, feminist subjectivity must move from one form of emotional practice to another. The negative emotional states associated with femininity, such as fear, guilt, and anxiety, can change their meaning through the constitution of collective subjectivity. This shift does not necessarily imply more positive emotional states. Feminist movement can make use of the bad feelings. These feelings, however, must be collectivized in order to become useful. Alison Jagger's concept of outlaw emotions can help us think about how this shift can happen. Jagger observes that emotion, while socially constituted, are not fully determined by social structures in the sense that that everyone feels the same thing. those who, quote, pay a disproportionately high price for maintaining the status quo, unquote, are more likely to experience outlaw emotions, that is, feelings that are not condoned in certain social situations. Some of the people who experience oppression and exploitation might begin to feel angry rather than scared or resigned. In Ali Hochschild's terms, such emotions do not pay the social debt owed by particular individuals. When isolated, the individual experiencing outlaw emotions might be seen as insane or emotionally disturbed, as a person whose emotional practices are out of sync with the expectations and pressures of normative social bonds. Silvia Federici writes that, quote, many women who have rebelled and are rebelling in this way, they are called insane. In reality, they are women who have not found any other way of refusing being exploited except by putting themselves out of use, out of being used, end of quote. In reading the insanity of women as a tacit form of refusal, non-normative or undesirable feelings can, quote, become politically because epistemologically subversive, end of quote. Feeling differently is also a way of knowing differently and knowing that the world could be different. Forming a collective feminist subjectivity, which is also a collective of feeling, allows people to find communal ways of refusing. Such refusals seek to turn the effects of exploitation outwards rather than internalizing them. One way of refusing was explored by the Geneva Wages for Housework group, Collectif L'Insemise. Their practice included direct actions, occupations, collective fare dodging, and prisoner solidarity. But it also included a more direct appeal to the emotional elements of struggle, as the group focused on collective forms of organizations for bad and angry mothers. Refusing the glorification of motherhood as self-sacrifice, Collectif L'Insemise celebrated the mothers, quote, whom society and right-thinking people consider bad because they don't do exactly what the state, the family, the church, and the cops want them to do, end of quote. And these women, they said, don't have the smell of resignation or sacrifice. Instead, they have the good scent of revolt and freedom. The recuperation of anger as a political practice allowed Collectif L'Insemise to move beyond individual fear of punishment for risky behavior and outlaw emotions. They used their writings to inspire collective feelings such as anger, frustration, and discontent. Refusing to be good mothers, that is, refusing the work demanded by the ideal of self-sacrificing white bourgeois motherhood, the group sought to mobilize those women who wanted more for themselves. They called on, quote, those who are trying to live as they like, those who complain everywhere at unemployment, at taxes, at the job, those who don't live only for their kids. The practice was not to foster better feelings than the resentment they were already experienced, but to mobilize those feelings in a way that amplified their liberatory possibilities. Outlaw emotion, Jagger argues, are not themselves subversive, but can be put to use in revolutionary political projects when integrating revolutionary values. They are appropriate to radical politics when characteristics of a society in which human suffering and exploitation is lessened, or is conducive to establishing such a society. She suggests that emotions have a valuable epistemological function as, quote, conventionally inexplicable emotions may lead us to make subversive observations. Outlaw emotions are essential to the refusal of emotional reproduction. Emotional labor can be described as the work to suppress or hide such emotions in order to foster more socially appropriate feelings. The collective feminist practice of anger is a way of refusing feminized emotional labor. While anger is a common state in more masculine emotional displays, it is a feeling that must be managed and suppressed in feminized forms of emotional labor, as well as absorbed from other people, in order to create a spirit of niceness. While the recuperation of anger within a feminist project might seem to simply affirm a more masculine emotional style, it's essential to refuse the refusal of feminized emotional labor. This does not imply that anger is the only emotional state worth amplifying, or that more feminized emotions are to be discarded. Rather, we should recognize the political power of anger when put to use by those who are exploited and oppressed, who is expected to respond to violence with compliancy. This also entails a more equitable access to various emotional states, moving away from the constitution of a supposedly authentic gendered being through emotional practices. In this way, the broadening of the feelings available to feminized subjects might point towards a horizon of gender abolition. A different and wider emotional practice could open the potential for a different non-feminized subject without affirming the emotional practice of possessive individualism. Anger is an ambivalent feeling, often used to repress events, not only by men but also by women against other women. As emotion is contextual in its nature, we must pay close attention to the political nuances of anger. In her essay, A Note on Anger, Marilyn Fry suggests that female anger is not an outlaw emotion per se. Women, she suggests, are allowed to express anger within their proper domain, that of the kitchen. It's when women's anger exceeds the privatized reproductive sphere that it becomes threatening to the emotional ordering of the world. Collective practice of anger could have the potential of to challenge the status quo. As Audre Lorde observes, every woman has a well-stocked arsenal of anger potentially useful against those oppressions, personal and institutional, which brought her anger into being. Focused with precision, it can become a powerful source of energy, serving progress and change. End of quote. Lorde argues for the use of anger to resist white, heterosexual, bourgeois femininity, which also perpetuates the oppression of other women. This femininity is constituted through practices of niceness that seek to obscure conflict and hierarchy, while at the same time perpetuating them. The wages for housework strategy of refusal can also be understood as a refusal of the individualizing and isolating aspects of emotional reproduction. Wages for housework authors take aim at the conditions of reproducing labor power, which under capitalist conditions are necessarily isolating. Refusing to reproduce oneself and others as labor power also means opening the possibility for other forms of sociality. Kathy Weeks reads feminist refusals in terms of the diffusion of affective capacities, which are currently narrowly situated in the sphere of family and romantic love, and increasingly also in the sphere of waged work. This opens a broader emotional horizon and challenges the privatization of feeling. Seeing the refusal of labor as a way of inventing forms of collective care takes us beyond the binary framework of refusal versus valorization of reproductive work. Refusal instead becomes a tool for the valorization of a different form of life.
Thank you. Okay, so I am very aware that people will want to chat with you, and you've got about sort of 15 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to frame this as like a super big, baggy question, Uber question, and then you can pick and choose what you want to kind of talk about or not, and then we'll throw it open to the floor. So I'm interested in how you would characterize the book's utopian horizon. So what it's aiming at, what it wants, and then to sort of end on maybe a particularly tricky note. I'm also interested in practicalities. So what kind of concrete steps do we need to take if we want to kind of edge toward that utopian horizon? And relatedly, what is your theory of change and how does it underpin the book? So just like a massive grab bag of like really difficult, profound philosophical questions, which you need to like wrap up in.
Okay, I'll try. I mean, I think we sort of, on the like utopian horizon, I think we sort of talked a little bit about it in terms of like trying to move towards something that's like where the access to care is not dependent on having a certain that being a part of a family, being a part of a romantic relationship, where people can have what they need just by being people in society, being among other people, and where feeling isn't so intensely privatized as it currently is. So that's the kind of the horizon I think we should be like working towards. I in this book and in some other contemporary feminist work, this is framed as family abolition, not in the sense of like necessarily removing the relationships that we have at the moment, but like making them unnecessary. For me, that's I think the sort of most profound change in society that we possibly could try to aim for, just because of the way that our sort of sense of ourselves and our being in the world are so structured by this like very privatized forms of care that we currently sort of have to strive towards. The question of how we get there is a little bit tricky, because I think it's quite hard to sort of like, as I was saying before, like you can't really just like be like, oh no, I don't want to have those needs, or I'm just gonna say no to those desires that all of society has sort of made me feel. And I think it's more a project of like trying to create the conditions in which we could have good, fulfilling lives without like having to participate in certain like very specific forms of sociality or being together, and that is often like very like practical things. Like I'm thinking about it in relation to my sort of current activist work, and also my current intellectual focus in terms of like housing, and how we sort of move towards a society where access to housing isn't sort of dependent on being part of specific forms of family, and or you know this because you write a lot about like domestic architecture, and how the very form of housing is sort of imposing certain types of work and certain forms of relationships on us. So like trying to like sort of move towards something that could actually enable like communal care in a very practical sense, I think would also like start to chip away at those like emotional bonds, because it could open up space for people to like be together with other people like in a very different sort of way. And I think it's like I was reading this thing about housing recently that was like a good analysis, like a Marxist analysis of housing, and in the end it got to this point being like, well, of course, the working class has no power in terms of housing, and we should just like focus on what we can really do, which is striking. And I was like,
oh, okay.
and I think I'm kind of at the sort of opposite end in terms of like, I think I have a sort of maximalist. I think we should have like as much struggle as possible in like as many places as possible, and the way that we can like really start to like build something different is to like challenge capitalist society in whatever forms it takes in our lives, and also I think it's really important that like structures of care, of like collective care, are built into our political struggles as well. So whatever part of sort of current society we are challenging, we also have the things that can sort of sustain that struggle, and make it sort of go beyond whatever thing it's challenging at the moment. And I guess that's the way I'm hoping I'm hoping change could happen.
Yeah, I love that way of coming at the problem through thinking about sort of the concrete. So thinking about like, well, you know, the way that space is organised now encourages us to kind of go form certain kinds of relationships. There's a form of material hegemony that's built into the built environment. And then thinking about intervening there rather than in the sphere of the normative, I think is just a very interesting way of doing it. So rather than like, okay, well, let's just change the way we feel and then change the spaces that we feel in, it's like, okay, well, let's do it the other way around. I always think of Hugh Firestone and the way he spoke about assisted reproductive technologies and sort of how the material world represented a space of intervention in the way that the normative world didn't. So he's talking about IVF and how actually attitudes to IVF, people were completely cool with the technology and these ways of rethinking how bodies could do things. But as long as that was being put to sort of normative use in terms of like allowing childless heterosexual married couples to have children, then you could rethink exactly what a body could do. Yeah, rethink it, but within a very strict normative framework. So it's interesting to come at these sort of swivel the problems round and think, okay, well, what happens when we come at it from a different angle? Okay, so let me throw it open to the people in the room. Does anybody have any sort of questions or comments, or would anybody come at this from a different point of view? Yes, at the back. Hello.
I was interested in kind of the parallels with sex work, because obviously at the moment there's a lot of thoughts around workers' rights in that area, and then also the way like historically it's seen with that kind of, it could be interesting in the context of emotion, because the way that we look at love, emotion, put people on a pedestal, and then when people fall off it, villainize them, and the way that often can come with people in sex work, but also now parasocial relationships, which kind of fall into, I guess, similar areas now that OnlyFans puts the two together. I was wondering if you thoughts around that as part of the movement forward, maybe.
Sure. It's not something that I sort of directly address in the book that much, but it's definitely like super important for this problematic. And I think that the way that like sex worker organizing has opened up a lot of sort of conceptual space for the feminist movement is like super important. And I guess I'm sort of thinking about emotional reproduction or emotional labor broadly from a sort of this is something that people do like unwaged, so within their families, within their like close relationships. And I think the way that like sex works is so stigmatized is also because it does like challenge that, and it's sort of within like a sort of patriarchal framework, a capitalist like ideology of the family. It's like fine to have someone who's like basically meeting their partner's sexual needs within like a family setting. Maybe that's like not ideal, like, but it's like it's okay. But as soon as it like sort of starts to like challenge that sort of division between what belongs in a sort of privatized, unwaged sphere of work and what's outside it, that becomes like very, very problematic for like a lot of the like moral discussions we have about what sex should be, what relationships should look like, what sort of emotional relationships should look like. And yeah, I don't really know if I have like any sort of very thought out like answers to this, but I think it's like interesting that this tradition of feminist thinking that I'm drawing on definitely like has a long tradition of like sex worker organizing sort of within it, and even in the sort of early 80s, when a lot of people were like sort of in the feminist movement were like distancing themselves from sex workers. That's not what like these groups that I'm looking at were doing, and they were like actually being like, well, this is clearly like something different from what like housewives are doing, but it's not unrelated. Like it still exists within the same sort of structure.
You think about Selma James and her work with the English Collective of Prostitutes. And that sort of stuff. Yeah, it's interesting. And you see that still now that there's this wages for housework has become this sort of like repository of thinking that a lot of sex workers use as a tool in their own organising. And then you see that relationship being sort of multi-directional, right, where the sex worker thinking gets then incorporated into broader feminist struggles, hopefully in a way that builds solidarity between different kind of nested causes under the feminist umbrella. I mean, I think one reason why sex work is so interesting as well is in terms of what we were talking about to begin with, in terms of how naming something as work can become the basis through which you can refuse work. Because I think this is one of the rare missteps that Kathy Weeks makes in her thinking, is she says, okay, well, you know, sex workers decide to label what they do sex work because they're trying to claim the dignity of work. They're trying to say this is a dignified pursuit, you know, this deserves the same kind of recognition as all other kinds of work. But actually, I think there's another layer to that actually what's happening is that they're not naming it as work because they think work is inherently dignified, and they're trying to mobilise that set of ideas. You know, there's an equally strong strand of sort of more anarchist-inflected, you know, sex worker organising, which is like, actually, we name it as work so we can refuse it as work, but not just as a sort of specialist, like, oh, let's abolish sex work. It's like, no, let's abolish work and sex work as part of that, rather than setting it up as a sort of special case, as a lot of sort of you know, careerist abolitionists, sex work abolitionists do. So, you know, it's very, very important, I think, for any kind of post-work or anti-work thinking is to figure out where sex work fits into that sort of the horizon that those projects are articulating. Yeah, absolutely. Any follow-up or any other questions?
I wondered if that's obviously a model you looked at. I wondered if there's any other models of. So you've talked about the future and the path for the future. If there's any kind of different cultures that you've looked at collective care from, because we talk about society, but where do we mean here, the West?
Yeah, I mean, I've looked at broadly from a like quite like Western perspective. Like I've looked at how care functions in like sort of Western like imperialist type states, and obviously I think that has an impact on like the rest of the world, but that's not like it's not so just that like that model has been like simply imposed on everywhere else. So I think it's important to like recognize that it's not, well, this is like a dominant model of care, it's not like universally applied. That said, I don't think I've like done a huge amount of like research into like how like sort of it's like culturally specific and how there are like different models for doing care like currently existing like in the world. I've done a little bit of like thinking about like, well, sort of within this dominant model of care, sort of within like North American, European countries, like what are the possibilities for doing care differently. So there's a short bit towards the end of the book, which is about sort of thinking about like queer emotional reproduction, thinking about sort of experiments with trying to come up with sort of collective models for those who have been very much like excluded from this sort of normative model of family, and have sort of decided to take refuge in other forms of care, not just as like a sort of withdrawing from society, but using that as a framework for like broader struggle. And I think what's kind of tricky about those experiments, I think they're like super important for like helping us think through what it could look like. They've often been like very local, very short-lived, because that like material, like the structure that we were just talking about isn't there. Like there isn't that material support to like build other worlds sort of within this one. But I think, you know, you just have to keep trying in a way. And like I think there's also something about like you know, saying that this is important and it's an important part of struggle, and we like need to keep sort of centering it within all the sort of the organizing that we do, the struggles. I don't know if that's exactly an answer to your question, but like that's kind of the way that I've tried to think a bit about this question of like sort of what's the relationship between the very like dominant like cultural model of care and those who kind of fall outside it, and that's often like also like migrants who like live within sort of European, North American societies who have like, because they have had a very like precarious like economic situations, have also been sort of have had to come up with other forms of doing things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the challenge, and the sort of this very careful sort of filleting operation that needs to happen when you're looking to historical examples. You know, everyone goes to Street Transvestite Action Revolutionary and Star House and to all of these kind of alternatives that have sprung up, you know, sort of queer, sex working, trans, migrant sort of alternatives. And how do you balance looking to those as being a model for a different way of doing things with the tendency to forget that they were born out of, you know, fundamental material necessity, you know, actually not having the resources to kind of live in other ways. So trying to recognize these things as alternative models within the system as it stands, without lapsing into sort of romanticism about them as being like, oh, if only we could live in this way. Well, actually, like, it's very, very hard and born of necessity, you know. Yeah. Do we have any final questions? Thank you so much to everybody for being here, and particular thanks to Alva for her brilliant book and for this lovely discussion. Thank you so much.
If you would like to buy They Call It Love, please head to our website, pagesofhackney.co.uk, where you can buy it for collection from the bookshop and for delivery nationwide. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe wherever you find your podcasts for more literary events like this one.